Hi, welcome. I'm Eleanor, and today is the 16th day of the Silly Challenge. We're officially past the halfway mark. Yesterday was exhausting, and I don't think I'm definitely not the only one. I picked up through Instagram, on a few people who were also feeling really done. I think if you take your poetry reading really seriously, it's really difficult to work through a book of poems while realizing that you're not really giving it the attention it needs or deserves, and yet you are giving it attention for that full, day and part of the night, depending on how much you sleep. So I chose a book for today that was actually perfect, and I recommend this book, Garden Time by W.S. Merwin. I highly recommend it to anyone. If anyone's doing the Silly Challenge and watching this by chance, it's a great book to read on a day when you need a break. Not because it's not good poetry. It's very, very good poetry, but the kind of poetry it is allows you to breathe. It's a meditative, quiet, thoughtful poetry written by a master of the art in his very old age. So I have to admit that this book broke my heart a little bit. It was written basically in the few years before Merwin died. He died in 2019 at the age of 91. I, for the first time, found myself crying. I have never cried while reading any poetry book. And I wept a bit about halfway through. It's a most remarkable book, and it's remarkable to come to it as a first book. I've of course heard of Merwin, and he's been on my TBR list for ages, and never got around to it. And then a few weeks ago at my local bookstore, I happened to see this book, and it's lovely, and it just has a lovely size to it. And I opened it up and I immediately felt a connection to it, but of course didn't read it because, why would you read a book that you bought? So it's really been one of the many gifts the Silly Challenge has given me, is the impetus to read it. Now, Merwin has written so many books, I think at least 40 books. And in the latter half of his life, I believe, he married his beloved wife, Paula, and they moved and lived for many years in Hawaii on the island of Maui. And it was there, I suppose, that he spent his last days. His eyesight began to fail while he was writing this book. And you can see that from the progression of poems. From what I've read, he dictated many of the poems to Paula as his eyesight got worse. But definitely towards the latter half of the book, if you're looking for it, you do notice that there's much more being written about sound than light or sight. And the particular way he writes about sight and light is unusual and very, very beautiful in a most unusual way, tending towards a little bit weird, which is just how I like my poetry. So the themes he's writing on are really the themes of an older person who's had a very good life with, of course, sacrifices, hardships that everyone goes through. But generally, he's happy. And And there's a poem towards the end of the book on page 66 that discusses happiness. It's called December Morning. And what I'll do is I'm going to link, it's available on the website of his conservancy. There's a Merwin Conservancy, I'll link to it, which dedicates itself to being an organization that brings to the fore art and ecology. And it's based on his land that he tended himself. There was a large plot of land that I think he and his wife bought and lived on and worked on. And now it's basically a Garden of Eden, from what I can tell, with native plants, native palms. And they encourage both the environmental movement and the poetry artistic movement, if you want to call it that. So I think at the end of this video, I'd like to read that out loud about happiness, and then you can read along because it's available. That poem is available on the site, and then it will be an introduction to you to the site, because I didn't know about that until today. So the themes he talks about are, of course, time. There's the idea of the actual numbers. So the time of day, is it morning, afternoon, evening, the numbers on the calendar, the seasons, looking back through his own memory, thinking about his own age. One poem actually discusses memory with a capital M. Then, of course, it's called Garden Time. And a lot of this book is based on how he feels and what he thinks about when he's either in his home looking out at the garden or walking through the garden, looking back at previous homes he's had, and then kind of bringing them into his own garden in the present moment. There's a lot of light play, light, dark, shadows. There are moments where you feel all the senses. There's touch, there's taste, there's sound as well. And all of the poems look a certain way. And I do like a book with poems that look a certain way. So I'll give you an example. They basically all look like this. And there's absolutely no punctuation. There's no punctuation whatsoever. And I, coming as a complete newbie to Merwin, didn't even notice that until I was on page 14. I actually marked it on page 14. I said, wait a minute, no punctuation? You don't notice it because he's a master. He's a master of poetry. And the way he writes, the way he works his phrases, his lines, his syntax, his images, you know instinctively how to read. There was almost no moment in the book that I stumbled at all. The lack of punctuation is not a trick. It's not a gimmick. It's the way he writes, and it just feels natural. It's as if punctuation never existed. And it also, I think, goes some way to the meditative floating effect that the poems have. And I would say if you're looking for a book of poems that will calm you down at the end of a long day, this is the one to keep on your bedside table. You read each poem necessarily somewhat slowly, because I don't know why, but that's just how it is. But not too slowly. You get to the end of it, and then you move on to the next one. Not because you've been given a little happy pill, not because you've been given a Hollywood ending and an explanation of something, just because it's almost like the end of a movement. If you're listening to a symphony and one movement leads to another, there's a silence and you move on. So I really do recommend this. It's not going to be a challenge. You know, you're not going to have to look things up and use a lot of your intellectual side. But at the same time, it's not at all simplistic or superficial. It's just perfect. It's perfect. I am definitely going to read more Merwin. I'm absolutely delighted that I bought this book, that I read it. I will go back to it again and again. I'm going to put it on my night table. And I just, you know, I'm just so glad that he lived, that he wrote so much, and that he has left that as a legacy. So now I'm going to read the poem on page 66, and you can go to the link at any time while I'm reading or afterwards to read it in print. It's called December Morning. And this is what it looks like. December morning. How did I come to this late happiness as I wake into my remaining days, another morning in my life with Paula, taking me by surprise like the first one? I know it is rash to speak about happiness with the fates so near that I can hear them. But this morning, even the old regrets seem to have lost their rancor and to harbor shy hopes like the first grass of spring appearing between paving stones when I was a small child. And I see that each step has been leading me to the present morning that I recognize before daylight. And I forget that I am almost blind. And I see the piles of books I was going to read next. There they wait like statues of sitting dogs, faithful to someone they used to know. But happiness has a shape made of air. It was never owned by anyone. It comes when it will, in its own time. Okay, thank you W.S. Merwin. Thank you Nicole Seeley for the challenge. I'll see you tomorrow. Don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. Thank you. Bye-bye.